And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable. Chapters is the television show that profiles local authors, editors, and publishers in our community. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are broadcasting this episode from Empire Books and News at Pullman Square in downtown Huntington. And our guest today is author Sylvia Thompson, and Sylvia Thompson was born in Lincoln County, the daughter of Harold and Eutha Lovejoy Scraggs. Sylvia dropped out of high school in the middle of her senior year because the 3 outfits of clothes she owned got burned up. She was already married at the age of 16, and neither her husband or father could afford to replace them. Sylvia got her GED at the age of 29, and when she learned she could go to college on her GED, she enrolled in Marshall's education program and majored in art. She got her BA from Marshall, and she has 56 hours beyond her bachelor's degree from Marshall, but the time limit placed on her was impossible while she was working and raising 6 children, so she never got her master's degree. Her book, John's Little Acre, took her 5 years to write, and she's now working on an epistolary book, a collection of books told in letter form, and all communication is done by letters dating back and through the period of World War II. It's called Nayaka's Reign because of all the storms in this young girl's life. And Sylvia taught art in junior high and middle school and 1 year in elementary school. She taught for 21 years and retired in 2002 after a bout with colon cancer. And we're just delighted to have her here today. Sylvia Thompson, welcome to Chapters. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you a little bit about writing. You have a variety of teaching experience at different grade levels, teaching art for a long time. How did you get interested in becoming a writer?
While I was teaching, I had duty outside with a teacher for an hour, and this was in middle school. And while we were watching the kids, we would just talk, and I would tell him stories about growing up. And one day he said, Sylvia, have you ever written any of this down? And I said, no. He said, do your kids know any of this? And I said, no. He said, you need to write this down. And I said, well, why? Everybody grew up like this. He said, Sylvia, nobody grew up like that. Really? Because I didn't think I had anything to say. And he said, you need to write some stories of this. He said, my wife will help you. And she agreed that she would. She was our language arts teacher. But, like everything else, I put it off. And finally one day I thought, well, maybe I could write something. So I told my husband, I think I'll write a book. And, of course, he thought, yeah, right. And but one day I came home and he had circled in the newspaper an announcement that Dr. Patrick Grace had put in. He was starting the first life writing class. And I thought, oh, that would be neat. That would help me get started. So I called the museum and they said, well, it's full. And I thought, nah, maybe somebody won't show up. I'll go anyway. So I went to the museum on the night of the class, and he read off, the list of students who had signed up, and he said, I don't believe I have your name here. And I said, no, sir, you don't. I was hoping somebody wouldn't show up and I could stay. And then he said, well, I'm not going to kick you out now that you're here. So I got involved in the first life writing class, and it was very helpful. But I was just going to write a little history for my kids. I was going to put it in a little spiral-bound thing and pass it out to them, or whoever in the family wanted it. And but when I'd read my stories, they would say, "Oh, you've got to put this in a book. You have to share this. You can't keep it for yourself." And Patrick was really good. He would give us assignments, and he encouraged us when we felt like we couldn't do it anymore. And I took the first class, and he was kind of doing it like the first class was about getting started, and then the second class would be about getting published and all that. Well, before I got to take the second class, I had colon cancer. So when the next class came around, I wasn't able to go. And I think it was about a year and a half before I got to go back and take more classes. And he kids me now because I'm a lifetime member of his classes. I'm now taking the 6th class. And but it helps to be around other people who are writing, and you just need that little jump start occasionally, a little bit of encouragement. And Patrick was really good about it. Sometimes I would get so discouraged, and I would call him crying, and I can't do this anymore. And he would say, you need to get in your car and come up here. And I would cry, and I would say, no, there's no place to park. And he'd say, come on up, Sylvia, I'll pray for a place to park, and there will be one. And there always was. Mm-hmm. And he would give me a pep talk, and I'd go back to writing. But it was very cathartic. Because some of the things that hurt so deep growing up, I was able, I guess over the years I just pushed them down and pushed them down. But I was able to get it out, get it on paper, and it still makes me cry, but it doesn't hurt. Mm-hmm. It doesn't hurt anymore.
I was going to ask you, and we'll talk more about your book here in just a little bit, but I was going to ask you, when you started writing, was the first instinct you had to look back on your life and use some of those experiences writing? I know Patrick's life writing class kind of emphasizes that, more of the memoir and the true-to-life fiction. Were you automatically, instinctually gravitated towards your life, or was that something through just getting started you gravitated towards?
No, that's what I wanted to do from the beginning, because well, I didn't feel like I had much to say on that, let alone anything else. So when I was talking with this other teacher friend, and he said I needed to write some of the stories down, but we talked about making molasses and hoeing corn and hoeing tobacco and cutting it and carrying it up in the barn, which I did as a very young child. I helped with all that. And he said, nobody does that anymore. You need to write it down for your kids. And then I would tell him about not seeing my mother from the time I was 9 until I was 16 and had my own home. And he would ask questions, why? And then I would tell him, well, my father was going to kill her, and he came to Huntington and bought a gun to do it with. And he hid out on Indian Grave Mountain and waited for her to come by, but all he could see was their faces. Sylvia, you've got to write this down. You've got to. Mm-hmm. So he kind of pushed me a little bit, and so I thought, well, I didn't know where to start. So I talked to Laura Bentley. Laura was a teacher there also, mm-hmm. and she had me come to visit her classes and talk about coal mining. The way we lived in coal mines, because we lived in Logan County for a while. My dad was a coal miner. And I would tell him about the script and the company housing and the company store and all that. And then she said, you should really write down some of these stories. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I should. So that was the direction I was leaning in from the beginning. But I never planned on a book. I was just going to write down a few things for history.
Okay, interesting. Let me ask you a little bit about your writing process, both then and now. When you get an idea to write, or you think about writing one of these stories from your life, how do you go from sort of the idea stage to the drafting stage to ultimately finally having a copy or a manuscript or a piece of the story that you're happy with?
Well, first I just write it. I don't worry about punctuation. I don't worry about sentence structure. My main goal is to get the story down on paper. And I can always go back and do the corrections. But it seems like that once I start writing, that it just flows. It's like, and there were things that I would start writing about, and then I would think, I'd write all this stuff, and I'd look back and I'd think, I'm not sure that really happened. And so I would call aunts or uncles or somebody, and I said, did this really happen? And then they could tell me, yeah, it did. You lived with so-and-so for a while, and when you left there, you went to live over here. And they convinced me, this did happen. So, and I didn't trust my memory, because when I started writing, I thought, I don't remember much of my childhood. I don't remember ever being in the fourth, fifth. I do remember a few things in the fifth, but seventh, eighth grade, I remember some of the ninth. I don't remember a lot of things that happened in my childhood. I remember my one toy. My dad bought me a scooter, and I had it about 3 days before I left it out in the road, and he ran over it with a truck. And he did not replace it. But that was to teach me a lesson, and it did. But I still miss my scooter. But, once I get started writing, it's like the memories just come. And now that I have finished this book and I'm working on the second one, I trust my memories now. I know they're real, and I know I'm not making things up.
Sure. Let me ask you a little bit too about John's little attic and.
It's acre.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry, acre. Excuse me, as if the attic and acre. Yes, John's little acre. Tell us a little bit about that book. What is in that book? You've given us sort of some great insight into your childhood and how that's influenced your writing. But how did you determine what was going to be in John's little acre? Of all the great stories you had to tell?
John's Little Acre is the name of the piece of land where I was born, in a 2-room log cabin delivered by a midwife who was my great aunt. And we lived here off and on until I was 9. We'd take a break. My grandmother owned the property at that time, and eventually my dad bought it. But we would move occasionally to the coal fields. We lived there about a year and a half. Then we moved over to 9 Mile for a little while, but we always ended up back at John's Little Acre. And that was really the only home that I ever knew where my brothers and sister and I were together, and Mom and Dad. I remember a little bit about the coal camp in Logan, but I don't remember much about the log house on 9 Mile. I remember living there. I remember the creek and just a few things, but not much about it. I don't remember where I went to school or anything about that. But the things that I wanted in here was so my kids would see what kind of life I had. And I hope I'm not going to cry. I really don't want to. And know me better, and that my grandchildren would know who I was. The stories was kind of funny because Patrick had told us we need an outline. Hated outlines in English. So I thought, well, I'll start by writing what I want to write about. So I wrote, I want to write a story about the Little Red Wagon. I want to write a story about my grandma's birthday. And back then, and probably still, there was an old saying that you can catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Could not figure out why people wanted to catch flies in the first place. So there was a tale about how I finally figured out what that was, so I wanted to write about that. So I wrote all these down, not in any particular order, and then I put them on the computer and made great big letters. Put them on the wall around the computer. And some days when I didn't particularly feel like writing, I'd walk through the dining room where the computer was, and I would look, oh, I think I'll write about that today. So I would sit down and get my notebook, and said I wrote everything in longhand. I would sit down and write about that particular thing. Well, it seemed easier that way than to think, I'm going to write this whole book. If I take it one little bit at a time and write it just about that story, when I get all those stories done, I'll have my book. And So I decided that was the easiest way for me to do it. And I told Patrick, I said, this is just the way I'm going to do it. And he said, that's great. And since then, I have told many other people. Patrick always had me come and talk to his class, and he always told me to mention my outline, or lack thereof.
Lack thereof, right.
But people said sometimes when they heard outline, it just took them back to English class.
Right.
But when they heard how I did it, it made it easier. And one lady said she just wrote her stories the same way, put them in an envelope, in a manila envelope, dated them, told what the story was about, and then when she got them all written, she just put them in order, and there was her book, and it just made it easy. I liked the easiness of not being bound, like you have to start at the front and you have to go all the way to the back. It was just easier because this way you can start in the middle if you want to.
Sure.
And so that's pretty much how I went about it.
How did you go, or what method did you use to seek out a publisher for your book? Was that a difficult process because your stories were personal?
Dr. Grace is a publisher. And I looked at other publishers because by this time there were online publishers. And one of the ladies in our class, when she came, Patrick always has a get-together in the summer for his groups. And when she came, her book was done. I mean, she had it published, had a cover, everything. And she had gone through iUniverse, and I thought, well, I could do that. But Patrick, he had helped me so much, I wanted him to do it because he was where he worked with me every step of the way.
Sure.
And even wrote a little blurb for the back of the book. So he published it. And the actual printing, I think, was done somewhere in Tennessee by, I don't remember the name of who did the actual printing, but it went through Publisher's Place, and their name Mid-Atlantic Highland Press, I think is what it was. I'd have to look at the book and see, but it was just easier that way. And it was affordable that way because unless you get a traditional publisher, you're paying all the expenses.
Right.
And I didn't think I had that much to say that a traditional publisher would be interested. Now I think they might.
Sure.
Back then I didn't have the confidence
Understand.
to think that they might be interested.
And, one topic of conversation that a lot of our writers talk about is the other aspect of publishing, which is the marketing of the book. And I know you and I were talking some before we taped our interview today, and you think maybe you've sold around 3,000 copies or so of your book.
Yeah.
How did you do it? What methods worked well for you? How were you able to get John's Little Acre out to a readership?
Well, I had local book signings. I had family members all over the country, and once they knew it was available, they wanted copies. I had one lady buy 13 copies at one time because she wanted to give them as Christmas presents. I had a lady just the other day buy 3 copies because she wanted to give them as gifts. I had a book signing at the library in Hamlin and sold 50 copies there.
Wow.
But the Lincoln Journal did a really nice story the couple days before I was going to be there, so lots of people came out. My father, he was fairly well known in Lincoln County. And my grandmother still lived in Hamlin. At that time, so all of the family that lived in and around Hamlin came, and I don't know how some people got copies because I got a letter from a lady in North Carolina who said how much the book had helped her, and Dr. Grace had told me that my book belonged in domestic violence shelters and it belonged in group homes. So I have seen that it is there. And I had a cousin in Maryland who bought 4 copies, one to send to him, and he wanted me to put the other 3 in different libraries.
Great.
So I put one in our library here, one in Barbersville, and one in the school library where I taught.
Okay. Very good. So you had a lot of avenues and a lot of different ways to get your book out there. That's terrific. And one thing that's interesting that you mentioned about putting books, in places like shelters and group homes. We have a lot of our writers that will consistently emphasize that their books do just as well outside of the traditional brick and mortar bookstores. A lot of writers think my book's only going to sell in a bookstore, but sometimes if you broaden out your readership base and think, where else could I put a book? Oftentimes those places are more than willing to carry a book if it has a tie-in with what they're doing.
I have some books right now in one of the stores on 14th Street West. I had a book signing at Tamarack, and they bought several books and sold out and reordered.
Right.
And I sold quite a few during my book signing there because there was a lot of travelers came through. I've put it in the hospice gift shop. A lot of the gift shops will take local authors' books.
Sure.
And be glad to. And people who are looking for a gift for somebody, if somebody's laid up in the hospital, that's a good place to look for a small book, not heavy reading, but if they're able to read, they can. So
Sure.
there's lots of avenues out there. It doesn't have to be a traditional bookstore.
Absolutely. Well, in our closing moments here, Sylvia, I wanted to give you a chance to read an excerpt from John's Little Acre and share that with our audience for folks that maybe want to get a little taste of some of the great stories. And I think one of the things they'll be so impressed about with your book is the great realism. That there's a realism and sort of a chin-up resolve that appears in a lot of your stories that I think our audience will identify with, and especially as you've been talking about, that a lot of your stories take readers really through a series of tough events, that people from rural and maybe economically challenged backgrounds will identify with. So we'll turn it over to you for the next few minutes and maybe set the scene for us a little bit. Where's this coming from? What story is this coming from? And what are we about to hear?
This was after my parents divorced. And Mom had moved, I can't remember if she had moved to Huntington or if she had gone at that time to Michigan. And my dad had gone back to the coal fields. And we were living with my mother's mother. And she got sick, and she sent word by the mail carrier to the other grandmother, my dad's mother, to come and get us. And this is when she was coming to get us.
Okay.
We were playing in the front yard at the foot of the hill when we heard the clip-clop of a horse and saw Grandma Berthy sitting atop the chestnut mare. Her brogan shoes were run over at the sides from too many months of wear. Sensible shoes, she would call them. She wore a homemade dress and an apron made from colorful feed sacks, ironed nice and crisp. In her apron pocket was the ever-present hanky to wipe the snotty-nosed children with. Her shoulders were bent with age from many years of hard work raising her children after Grandpa Scraggs died in 1921. Her long gray hair was gathered up in a roll around the top of her neck. Her hazel eyes and stern look softened as she looked at Johnny and Judy, but turned hard again as she looked at me. She placed Johnny, age 5, and Judy, age 2, atop the chestnut mare. Johnny, being the big brother, lovingly placed his little arms protectively around Judy and held on for dear life. Grandma and I walked the 5 miles or so to 9 Mile. It began to sprinkle rain just before we got to Grandma's house. By the time we arrived, it was pouring down hard. Once there, Grandma told me she would keep Johnny and Judy, but she couldn't stand the sight of me. I looked away to the window so she wouldn't see the tears in my eyes. Why did she hate me? I'd never done anything to her. Why was she saying such mean and nasty things to me? I stared at the rain pounding on the windows like tiny little fists begging to be let in. That's how I felt. I wanted to pound on Grandma's chest over her heart and beg to be let in. Instead, as tiny cracks began to appear in my heart, I summoned up some emotional mortar to patch them with. I kept a straight face and never let her know how badly she had hurt me. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction.
Very good, very good. Sylvia Thompson, the author of John's Little Acre. Thank you so much for being with us on Chapters. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We also want to say thanks to our friends and partners at Empire Books and News, located at Pullman Square in downtown Huntington, for providing our facilities for taping this episode of Chapters. We encourage you to come down and check out the books and magazine selections that they have here at Empire Books and News. They have the Tri-State's largest selection of magazines, and no matter what genre or age group of books you're looking for, they have the book for you. And if you've seen some of our other authors that have been profiled here on Chapters, or you've seen some of the other editors and publishers we've had as guests on Chapters, many of the books that were written by those authors and produced and published by those publishers and editors are on sale here at Empire Books and News. So if you've seen a previous episode of Chapters and you've enjoyed what you've heard and you want to get a copy of that writer's book, we encourage you to come down and check out the selection at Empire Books and News, and we appreciate them partnering with us today for this episode of Chapters. And finally, if you have a question, comment, or suggestion about this Chapters program or any other Chapters program you've seen here on Armstrong, and we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email right to the show at the bottom of your screen, at the address that's appearing at the bottom of your screen. It's LP4, letter L, letter P, number 4, at zoominternet.net. We appreciate all the email and the feedback that we get, and we do read those and implement your suggestions. So please keep those comments coming. We really appreciate it. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters. Please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.